Hey, buddy, we are investigating a matter here, and we need for you to come down to the station with us. Did you not hear me? You come in with me.
We are talking Scary Tales, The Dead Zone, and this is a low-budget anthology movie with 3 short stories and a wraparound. So the wraparound features a couple who are kind of on the verge of getting divorced, and their car breaks down in a kind of lonely stretch of kind of desolate kind of road, and they manage to find a house where there is a single guy in there, and he offers them to come in while he calls a tow truck. But there's something fishy going on. Time doesn't seem to be passing normally, things like this. So to kind of like keep everyone entertained, they kind of, this host, this guy, ends up telling these kind of stories. Now, let's talk about briefly what the kind of the stories are, and then we'll kind of go into my thoughts on what this anthology is like. So the third story is, I would say, maybe the most fantastical, and this is about a police detective who is trying to track down a killer of children. And there's someone who has confessed to the crime, but this police detective doesn't believe he's the real killer. And the real killer may, in fact, be this kind of demon that kind of walks around in this kind of large kind of black hat, you know, pushing a cart which is playing this kind of kiddie music and stuff, and called the Muffin Man. That's kind of your first story. Your second one is about this older gentleman who apparently used to work for the US government, and he gives this other guy a severed alien head because he kind of wants to expose ultimately what's kind of going on, and this causes this other guy to be approached by the Men in Black. And our third story is about a reporter who notices the same guy keep cropping up in a variety of photos across you know, decades apart, and this guy's always kind of looking the same, for example, and she might think he's a time traveller. So there you go to your basic kind of like synopses for all of the stories. Let's discuss. Well, I mean, I'll be honest with you. Let me ask you this question. Do you like latex? Yes, latex. If you like latex, particularly latex masks, and particularly latex masks that you can buy from a Halloween shop, then you may like this movie because, oh yes, this features some very obvious, clearly shop-bought latex masks, if I'm honest. This is a very, very low-budget film, and it really shows. It really does show. Let's talk about what I think works in this movie before we kind of get into what doesn't. I will say the stories have ambition. The stories are also a little bit different from one another. They're not kind of rehashing the same plot. So we have these kind of, if you encapsulate the kind of the wraparound story, which does actually kind of call back to some of these kind of short stories, admittedly, they're all, you know, different plots. I've seen a few kind of anthology films where you more or less have the same plot repeated, which is the kind of like a little bit of kind of different window dressing. Yes, all 4 of these stories have a different plot. All 4 of these stories, I would say, actually have somewhat of an arc in them, and all 4 of these stories are ambitious. So what does that mean? I think that generally means, I would say, the kind of the writing here and the ideas behind the stories, at least in its conception, I think are reasonable. It's just that with the execution ultimately is where the kind of the movie maybe fall down a bit. But in its inception, I think there are some decent ideas here. Admittedly, there are kind of concepts which I feel have been either borrowed or you've at least seen before in kind of different kind of media. But nonetheless, I'll give it props for having some kind of ambition, some vision about what it wants to do, and at least somewhat of an, you know, an interesting kind of arc that the characters will go on within the movie. Despite, I think, this movie clearly being very low budget, there is a kind of a reasonable amount of fun to be had from the kind of the VFX work. Now I'll point out that the third short story doesn't really have any VFX at all. It's just more of a kind of like a Twilight Zone kind of concept one. But the first two movies and the wraparound, because it kind of does tie into the all three of the movies, you know, have kind of like at least kind of some type of kind of VFX, mainly these practical kind of masks, and they don't look good. They don't look good. But I like the kind of the idea. So it's particularly from our first one. There's an interesting kind of you know, choice of what this kind of creature kind of looks like. From a distance, it kind of looks human, but you get up close and it kind of looks kind of like freaky. It's very obviously a mask, but like again, I kind of like the idea, and it's a kind of a fun idea to a certain degree, and all of the cast are kind of taking it kind of somewhat kind of seriously to a point really, which gives it this kind of like cheesy quality that isn't legitimately good, but it's kind of like fun in a kind of like hokey way, I would say. But you know, again, at least the you know, they are sort of, I feel, committed into their roles. Because this film doesn't have like loads of stories, it really only has the three kind of like shorts ultimately are still reasonably lengthy. So I do feel at least there is, you know, you get some kind of movement in like a plot within it. I think the problem again with some anthology films, the shorts tend to be more vignettes without really any story exactly, and therefore you never really connect to characters. This one, you know, you do feel there's like a you know, movement in our kind of protagonist's kind of plot within the film. So, you know, that's basically what I can say, what I think works in this movie. Now, again, we have to bear in mind this is a very, very low budget film, so we can't really expect a, you know, a highly polished product or, you know, high production values. That being said, do I think that when someone watches this film, they're going to go, that's a very low budget movie, so I'll give them the kind of the benefit of the doubt on this? No, because that's not what people think. So we have to really look at this film in the kind of the cold light of day, and how it's kind of would be viewed by people. And it comes across as very cheap. As I've mentioned, these masks, especially the alien ones, really just look like standard like alien masks that you would buy from a Halloween shop. Even the mask from the first movie, you can clearly see where the kind of the mask ends. Like, haven't bothered to kind of like trying to use makeup to kind of like blend the kind of like the end of the mask into the kind of like the, you know, the neck area and things like that. It's just like a rubber mask with a horrible like glistening kind of like black wig as well. It really just looks like someone's bought a kind of a mask from a shop, put it on, and then put the camera on. That is unfortunately what it looks like. There's also a little bit of horrible green screen in this movie, which is very kind of like obvious. So VFX wise, you know, it's not good. And we have this, for example, this, again, going back to these kind of latex masks, we have this alien head in a jar, and it's just a kind of like a mask, when you can even see the bottom of it. So again, you're thinking, okay, if you've got this kind of limited budget and you're trying to pass off this latex mask in a jar, a head, at least shoot it so you can't see like the bottom of the mask, like where you know where you put your head in. At least kind of shoot it top down so you can't really see the kind of the seams. But they don't. They just kind of like, that'll do. So I think the kind of the direction here isn't strong, because they're not using the budget effectively. They're just kind of shooting it and kind of not thinking, how can I get around this kind of like these budgetary restraints? You know, we had these sequences in the first short film where we're meant to believe that they're these two police officers talking, and it just looks like two people talking in a house. You know, there's very little actual kind of attempt to mask the budget here. So this movie, I feel, is kind of like, the ideas I think are relatively solid. Had this been, you know, a Tales from the Dark Side, a Twilight Zone style movie, you know, it would have been more finessed. It would have had budget. It would have had a bit more production value, and it would have had better acting, quite frankly, because the acting also is, you know, not of a quality that you would possibly expect if you were watching, you know, a series like The Twilight Zone or Tales from the Dark Side at all. So yes, it's very kind of cheap looking. And you know, it's maybe they should have like lent into the kind of the goofiness a little bit more. Maybe it should have kind of like, you know, if it can't afford to do a serious kind of like sci-fi horror movie, which it's trying to do, it should just kind of like maybe have a bit more of a goofy side to it or a gory side to it. But there definitely could have been ways to, I think, make this movie, you know, the budget kind of, you know, a bit more hidden, because it really does kind of just like look very, very cheap, very kind of quickly kind of put together, and you know the direction is relatively poor. You'll even see, for example, like different like lighting on screen. So you have the same, what's meant to be the same sequence or the same actors, and then the kind of like the level of lighting will change depending on what angle you're looking at. Things like this. So you know, production-wise, it's quite amateurish. So what do we think about this movie in general? If you are just a big movie fan and you can just appreciate low budget kind of amateur movies, but you know you're not interested in a fairly good ideas, maybe, even though I think some of these ideas, the execution just on the ideas wasn't all that particularly good, there's maybe some stuff to enjoy here. But for the most part, I have to say it's just kind of like I feel the budget is just not there for this kind of level of ambition. But even on top of that, I think there would have been ways to make this more effective, and to make it more of a dramatic film and more of a kind of a scary film, more of a ultimately more polished film. Even with the budget that we've got, it just feels to me that it was a little bit kind of like amateur hour in regards to how this film was kind of put together. So how to kind of rate this one? I have to be honest with you, I've got to give this one a 3 out of 10. I can't really give it higher than that, but like just for the finished product is very, very amateur. But I have to say the creative ideas behind it, there is something there for the people who are involved in that side of stuff. I think if they hone the craft, you could best, you know, possibly go into kind of like bigger and better things. I just felt it needs to be a little bit more finessing and a little bit more kind of clearly investment in it. So it's a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please do leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.